So welcome, my name is Farah and I am a clinical social worker from the US. I work at the LightHouse Arabia and we're a mental health clinic located in Dubai. And this is the Your Mind Matters webinar. And it is my favorite webinar because everything I'm going to speak about today is actually everything that I wish I knew when I was younger. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Right, great. And I'm also the director of our mental health first aid program at the Lighthouse. Okay, so how many of you have heard of the Lighthouse before? If you could just raise your virtual hands. Yeah, a lot of people. Okay. So we're the largest outpatient mental health clinic in the Gulf region, and we're a team of about 30 psychologists and 3 psychiatrists who really love what they do. And we're really on a mission at the Lighthouse with everything that we do to destigmatize mental health in the region. And our dream really is that mental health will be responded to the same way physical health is throughout all sectors of the UAE. And we have, besides providing individual therapy, we have really, I think, more than a dozen free of charge support groups that range from grief or fertility or divorce. And you can find more about that on our website. We are also the only accredited provider of mental health first aid. Okay. I'm going to go back really quickly. And I'll just say that I'm going to actually stop sharing. One of the reasons why this topic of your mind matters is so important to me is that, growing up in a Pakistani American household, no one actually ever said, "How are you feeling?" or "What is," or even said the words mental health. And years into my professional career as a therapist, I found that this is the experience that many people have, whether they're American or Indian or Emirati or Lebanese or British, that many of us have grown up in a very emotionally phobic culture. And we've received a lot of misinformation about what mental health actually is. And so today is really about understanding what it is, what is mental health and how is it different from mental illness? What is the difference between normal sadness versus depression, normal worry versus an anxiety disorder? And we'll also be speaking about what are the tenets of basic emotional hygiene. Okay, so I'll just share my screen with you. And I want you to hold this in mind when you're thinking about mental health. Like, what was your understanding of those words and emotions growing up? Okay, so when we look at mental illnesses, right? Now, mental health and mental illnesses are not the same thing. And mental illnesses are going to be things like depression, anxiety disorders, or addiction. And what we find is they're extremely common. So we know that 1 in 4 people struggle with their mental health. That means a quarter of the people on today's call, a quarter of the people on your teams, in your social media, are currently struggling with their mental health. I would argue that it's more than 1 in 4. I think 2 in 4 or 3 out of 4. And I say that because this number, this statistic from the World Health Organization is pre-pandemic. All of those stressors and adjustments aren't even considered in that number. That 1 in 4 number, it also comes from developed countries. So it was more Western or English speaking countries besides Japan. It was like the US, the UK, Australia, Japan. These are some of where the statistics came from. And if we look at help seeking behaviors in minority communities, it's significantly less. And then even if you look at stigma in other countries, it's help seeking, seeing a professional, it's very, very rare. Okay, I think it's changing, not so rare, but the stigma is more pervasive. Okay, and that number does come from people who have eventually sought professional help. Mental illnesses do not care. So, depression does not care whether you're a millionaire or you have 100 dirhams in your bank account right now. It impacts all of us equally, right? So you'll often hear of the marathon runner that goes on to develop cancer, right? The same is true for mental illnesses. You can do things that make you healthy or build immunity against developing mental illnesses, but no one is truly immune. Okay. And I bring up the resource issue because very commonly I'll have clients that come to me and they'll say, I have a good job, I have a family. Why do I feel this way? Right? And having resources does not make you immune from developing illness. Okay. Every 40 seconds around the world, someone dies by suicide, and it tends to be more men than women. We know that depression is the second most common illness of all illnesses, both mental and physical. That means, more so, I think number one is actually cardiovascular disease, and then it is depression. Okay. And it's very disabling. Living with certain mental illnesses are very disabling. And I know the word mental illness can sound big and scary. Really, we're talking about depression, anxiety disorders, and addiction. So when we look at, well, how disabling is it to live with certain mental illnesses? Okay, particularly we'll take a closer look at depression. And this was a side-by-side study done by WHO, and they were ranking disability. And anytime a health organization ranks disability, and countries actually rank disability, you're looking at the level of interruption any health condition causes on your ability to work, function, so taking care of your daily tasks, and so work, function, and your relationships. Okay. And they also add in a component that's a little bit vague, which is contributing to your community, whatever that means to you. Community can mean your family, your workspace, your country, or so on. Okay. And what they found was that living with mild depression is as disabling as living with epilepsy and more disabling than living with low back pain. Living with moderate depression is as disabling as living with severe asthma. Severe post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder you often hear linked to veterans, is as disabling as living with severe chronic emphysema or bronchitis. Severe PTSD is more disabling than severe vision loss, severe asthma, epilepsy, and low back pain. Living with severe depression is as disabling as living with disseminated breast cancer. And what we mean by disseminated is that the cancer is actually spread to other parts of your body. Okay? Severe depression is more disabling than severe chronic emphysema, bronchitis, severe vision loss, severe asthma, epilepsy, and low back pain. Okay? And severe schizophrenia, which is a type of psychotic disorder, is as disabling as living with severe dementia. Okay. And those last two, severe schizophrenia is also considered a physical illness. So I want you to just take a moment to absorb this, right? Imagine that one of your colleagues or someone you care for comes to you and they say, I'm really struggling with my asthma this week. It's dusty outside, and I'm feeling anxious that I'm going to have an asthma attack in tomorrow's meeting. Right? Most of us may say, okay, check in with your GP. Do you need to reschedule the meeting? What can I do to support you? Right. Now, imagine that same colleague comes to you and says, I'm really struggling to get out of bed today because of my depression. People will say things like, come on, be positive. At least you're in Dubai. At least you're in the UAE. Be grateful for what you have. And rather than responding with support and empathy, we actually end up doing more harm by dismissing their experience or trying to fix what they're saying, right? Or what we call toxic positivity. And it's a really harmful approach to have. And I really hope that there's kind of two core things you're taking from today. Not only that your mind matters, but also how to have more empathy towards yourself or towards someone else who may be struggling. Okay? And I'll just name that, when we look at things like depression, it is a very biological and psychological illness. And when people say to you, I feel low, I feel empty, I feel hurt. When you look at what we call fMRI scans, it's a scan that we do and you look at the brain. And when we experience physical pain, certain centers light up in our brain. When people are experiencing emotional pain, those same pain centers light up. And I name that because when people say to you, I'm feeling hurt or I'm not feeling okay, they're actually not being abstract. They're being quite scientifically accurate. And it is important that um, we are curious and consider when we experience emotional pain or someone else's in our life as well. Okay. So, what is mental health, right? Usually, what I hear over and over again, people say mental health is, I don't know, something only crazy people have, or you only go to the doctors if something's like seriously wrong with you, or there's a lot of fear connected to this word. And I want to say that every single person has mental health. So, everyone on this call has mental health, right? The same way we all have physical health. Mental health is not the same thing as mental illness. Okay. And essentially, what we mean by mental health is the health of your thoughts, feelings, and your mind. And I love this image because I just love learning about space and nature and anything that has to do with David Attenborough. And what you'll find is that there are as many neurons in your mind as there are observable galaxies in the universe, which is billions. Our mind is extremely sophisticated. Okay, so I need you to know that our mental health lives on a continuum. So it's usually shifting. So, for example, some days or weeks you can have really good physical health. You're working out, you're taking your multivitamin, you're feeling really good, you're drinking enough water. And other days or weeks you can have poor physical health where you're feeling exhausted, aches and pains. Like you maybe you're not working out and you've gained weight or lost weight. Our physical health is always shifting, right? Now, we can have poor physical health but not have any kind of disease, but you will be at risk. And the same is true for our mental health. Sometimes you can have really good mental health where you're feeling optimistic, you're feeling your feelings, you're being empathic towards yourself, you're feeling proud of something you've worked on, you're feeling hopeful, connected to the people in your life. Okay, you have good mental health. Um, Other days or weeks, we can have poor mental health. You're feeling exhausted, you're feeling cynical, inadequate, worthlessness, you're being hard on yourself, you've gotten into an argument with someone, maybe you're feeling lonely, and there is poor mental health. Okay. And really, a central part of poor mental health will be a lack of consideration of your feelings, being dismissive, negligent, or self critical. We're definitely going to see poor mental health. Okay. Now, when do we say that someone has shifted from poor mental health to a mental illness? And really, I don't want you to just be thinking about others in your life. I want you to be thinking about you as well. Like, when have I had poor mental health? And when may it have shifted? Or how do I know if it's shifted into something more serious? And so, when we see the onset of a mental illness, and that's a broad, this is like an umbrella definition, right? And mental illness, depression, anxiety disorders, addiction, or so on. You're going to see significant changes to your thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. Okay, so the inner world becomes quite loud, or even that feeling of hopelessness starts getting really loud, like it feels a bit hijacking, or even the worries start to feel like they're hijacking your mind and your body. Okay. And you may see that the inner world is now beginning to disrupt different parts of your life. It may be one dimension or it may be several. For example, it may be, if hypothetical Johnson is struggling, you may see that his work is being impacted. You may see that relationships are being impacted or friendships, or you may see his ability to function, right? Like getting out of bed, showering, taking care of kind of the daily tasks of life, right? Or you may see physical health impacted. Now, you may have someone that's doing fine at work, but their relationships are suffering, or their physical health is. But the longer it goes untreated, the more likely it is to worsen and to impact all of these different domains. And it's not just a few difficult days. We all have had a few difficult days, especially in this last year and a half, right? It's more than that. It's that most days feel like difficult days. Most days feel hopeless or like it's hard to function. Okay. And I name that because for many people who struggle with depression, they'll say, well, I had such a productive day at work yesterday and I was laughing. Does that mean that I'm not experiencing depression? And the answer is no. It's about the inner world, and most days will feel difficult. Okay. That's the broad definition. When you imagine how someone may appear who's struggling with depression, we tend to have almost a subconscious image of someone who's like really unwell. Or I think of that movie, like the one who flew over the cuckoo's nest with Jack Nicholson, right? Like they'll be a bit just off, or maybe they'll be like Eeyore from Pooh. Does everyone know who Eeyore is? If you could just raise your virtual hand. He's quite a, so lots of hands going up. He's quite a cynical character. If you say good morning to Eeyore, he says things like, it's probably not going to be a good morning. And the thing is that when you or someone in your life is struggling with their mental health, they may appear this way. You may be feeling tearful, like there's a dark cloud above you, but oftentimes this is not the case. So I think of high performing individuals, right? That someone who's struggling can be the high performing team member, the very bubbly one, the comedian in the group, the one that seems to have it all together. So I think of people like Martin Luther King, who is a famous American civil rights leader, and he had two suicide attempts as a teenager and struggled with depression throughout his life. Princess Diana struggled with an eating disorder and anxiety. Michael Phelps is the most decorated Olympic athlete and swimmer in the history of the Olympics. And he's talked about his struggle with debilitating anxiety and suicidal thoughts. Dwayne Johnson, depression. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, has talked about his struggle with anxiety. Okay. And I name this because our mental health is very invisible. We can be functioning, but inside feel very unwell. And especially in the age of social media, we see these really curated, perfect images of our friends, of our colleagues, and we think they have it all together. And it's really often not the case or not representative of what is happening inside. Okay. And I name this because sometimes in organizations, you'll say, well, that person's doing so well. They're doing so great on their KPI, so they must be okay. And that's often not the case. You can be doing really well in one domain, but really be struggling inside as well. You can be struggling with anxiety and appear quite confident, or even, like you have it together. You can be having suicidal thoughts, but turn up to work and seem to be fine. You can be having a panic attack moments before having a meeting, having a presentation, or be performing in some way. Okay. And I know, no, I didn't have a panic attack before this, guys, but it can happen. You can be struggling with depression and be making jokes. You can be deemed the team player, but internally feel a sense of inadequacy or worthlessness. And you can be in senior leadership or the owner of a company, but internally feel like an imposter. Okay. Now we can all have moments of feeling inadequacy. It's a very human feeling. We can all have moments of feeling like, I don't know what I'm doing. I feel kind of like a fraud. But we're saying when someone is experiencing a mental illness, it's not like a one-off. It's most days I'm feeling this way. Most ways I'm having that poor mental health inside of my mind. Okay. When we're struggling with our mental health, our mind is directly connected to our body and our body connected to our mind. They actually share a neurochemical language, right? And there's lots of very interesting studies done on the connection between certain physical illnesses on our mental health and vice versa. And one study that really shocked me the first time I read it is they looked at people living with cancer and no depression, and cancer and depression. And what they found was that if you were living with cancer and depression untreated, that it could shorten your life for up to 3 decades, which is just alarming. Okay. We know that if you're living with depression, it will also worsen symptoms of diabetes, chronic physical pain, and so on. And these studies have been replicated in many other physical illnesses like anxiety and GI issues or IBS, or the list goes on, and stroke survivors as well. Okay. Now, the dream with mental health care is really the same as physical health care, which is early intervention. If we can catch something sooner than later, then it's not going to get worse. It's not going to, interrupt other parts of your body or your life, right? So the dream is, if you think you're a little bit off, you're like, I just don't feel right. I don't feel like myself. Check in with the therapist sooner than later. Now, therapy is not the only way, but there are other emotional hygienic behaviors that I'm going to speak about at the end, and you'll want to get super protective of that. Okay. We know that 2 in 3 people will never ever seek professional treatment. And the most common reasons, not the only ones, will be stigma. What will other people think? I'm not crazy. I can go at it alone. I just need to figure it out. I just need to be positive. So that stigma, but also misinformation. So not knowing where to go, or even the seriousness of, I didn't know that was depression, or I didn't know that was anxiety. And we're going to talk about what those things are so you do know. And another really interesting stat I learned about, I think 2 years ago, which was most people will have their first episode of a mental illness, so it may be depression or anxiety, at the age of 14. It then typically goes undiagnosed for 10 years, a decade, before that person ever gets professional help. So you can imagine, usually around university time, right? So imagine for 10 years living with an illness and thinking, if only I were stronger, better, faster, prettier, more handsome, then maybe I would be okay, right? That is going to impact your self esteem, your relationships, your career choices, what university you go to, right? It's quite alarming. But again, the dream is early intervention. And I want to speak about risk factors. So, what are some things in your life that you may experience that may make you more or put you more at risk of developing a mental illness? Okay, so if you have a family history, and I will say most people do not have the knowledge that there's a family history, because when we go back a generation, there's even more stigma, right? Parents or grandparents are like, we didn't have time to think about how we were feeling, or we survived a war, or what is this emotions? So oftentimes it's undiagnosed. And I'm usually listening for, I'll ask people, is there a history of depression or anxiety? And they're like, no, but my mom, she was such a worrier, and my warrior, not warrior, warrior. And my dad, he just was so quiet. He never really left the room, and he kind of drank a lot. Right? And we're already hearing anxiety, possibly depression and addiction. So be really curious, because if there's a family history, you're more at risk. If you're living with any physical illnesses, hormonal imbalances, thyroid imbalances, vitamin D deficiency, all of these can sometimes be the root cause for disruption in our sleep and in our mood. Okay. If you're living with a disability of some sort, and many side effects for medication can often be a cause as well. So, like a lot of fertility medication, a lot of acne medication is really disruptive for mood. So, that creates a lot of risk. Okay. So, psychological risk factors will be, if you have low self-esteem, if there's a chronic feeling of inadequacy, if you're highly self-critical with yourself, where you do something and you're not forgiving towards yourself, so that kind of lack of compassion, right, is going to be a huge risk factor for going on to have poor mental health or a mental illness. And you can imagine, if most of us have grown up in environments where, like, I don't even know how to feel my feelings. Like, I was taught to ignore them. And especially for men, when the programming and the teaching has been, don't feel your feelings, suck it up, don't be a girl, you can imagine that is an enormous risk factor for then having poor mental health, because you're like, I don't know how to be kind to myself or feel my feelings because I've been taught to ignore my inner world my whole life. That is a really big risk factor. Okay. So if you tend to be quite cynical, if you are perfectionistic, and remember, perfectionism is very fear based, it's very different from healthy striving for excellence, right? So I want you to imagine a perfectionist. If we're, I don't know, you can imagine like a car, that fear is in the driver's seat and maybe even in the passenger seat. With healthy striving for excellence, your values are in the driver's seat and fear may be in the trunk of the car. Okay. And if you're South African, I think it's the boot of the car. So, but perfectionists will say, oh God, what will everyone think if I don't do well on this? No one's going to like me. What's going to happen? There's a lot of catastrophizing and fear. And if perfectionism is driving, you can imagine that you are exhausting a lot more fuel and headed for burnout. Okay. Now, if you have a history of trauma or abuse in childhood or even more recently, that is a really big risk factor. And I'll highlight that if you have, the really obvious abuse or trauma for childhood are going to be things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. These are some of the ones that come to mind, right, when we think of childhood trauma. But there are also these things called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that are also trauma. So things like living in an unsafe environment, war, having a parent who is struggling with a physical illness, a bereavement in your life, a loved one who's struggling with addiction or is incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence. All of these are also part of childhood trauma. Divorce, big moves, that's all childhood trauma. Now, if you have 3 to 4 ACEs or childhood trauma, you're going to see that you are 12 times more likely to experience depression or anxiety into adulthood. And if we see 5 or more, we also see that you are 4,000 times more likely to experience certain types of addiction. And I name that because time does not heal all wounds, right? And the impact of childhood trauma really impacts us long into adulthood. So that's a really big risk factor. If you're experiencing grief, that is also a risk factor. Now, grief is, and I actually specialize in grief, but grief is not a clinical disorder, but it's such an enormous cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual injury that it does create a lot of risk. Okay. And if you have a tendency of comparing yourself, I always see comparison as a behavior that lowers your emotional immune system. And most of us are unconsciously doing this on social media. Okay. Other risk factors, I think number one is like experiencing a global pandemic. That's a risk factor. Being an expat, loneliness, if you're being bullied, any racism or discrimination. Poverty would actually be one of those ACEs that we talked about in childhood. Same with war. If you're going through a breakup or a divorce, that's a risk factor. Any kind of financial or legal struggles as well. So I want you to imagine, if you're looking at this and you're like, wow, I have a lot of risk factors, I would say check in sooner than later, right? Or even with a friend or a loved one, I would encourage them to have some early help seeking behaviors if you have a lot of risk factors. Okay, and I'll just name as well, you can have all of those risk factors or many of them and not go on to develop depression, but there's a lot of risk. So let's take a closer look at depression and anxiety, because these are the two most common types of mental illnesses. And then we'll speak about emotional hygiene. Okay. So, how many people in today's session like Harry Potter? If you could just raise your hand. All right. Wow. Okay. Many people. And I didn't say Ramadan Kareem for those of us who are fasting. Happy Ramadan. So there are these creatures in Harry Potter, and they're called Dementors. And they are these shadowy creatures from the Ministry of Magic. And when they come near Harry Potter, it's like white light is leaving his mouth. And he says, it's like, all happy memories have just left your body and they feel miles away. And the author of this movie describes these creatures as depression, and they kind of look like jinns, like which are like these Muslim demon things. But I name that because depression is not just feeling sad. At most, it's feeling empty and devoid of emotion altogether. And one of the core symptoms will be no longer being able to enjoy things that you once used to. So imagine all of the things you love doing, eating, smell, and now you know I'm fasting, right? Like eating, sleeping, scents, walks, music, like all of the people you love spending time with, your children, your spouse, your work, all of those things that you're like, yes, I love this. Imagine not being able to feel that, almost like there's this barrier of numbness or pain between you and that thing. It's really terrifying and disabling. And that is a really core symptom. I will have people say to me, work used to mean everything to me, and now I just don't care. Or I used to love spending time with my children and my spouse, and now I just don't care anymore. That is a hallmark symptom of depression. Okay. And I'm just emphasizing this is also very biological, right? So if you look at the architect of sleep and someone who is depressed, it's completely thrown off. You know, usually there's actually a pattern of sleep that we go through, right? So common signs and symptoms, be thinking about within you, and you're never diagnosing. But if you're like, oh, I think I'm feeling this, then you want to check in with your GP or a counselor. So if you're feeling low for most days, at least 2 weeks, and it's interrupting your world in some way, okay, that's not just work. It's your mood, it's your relationships, it's your ability to function. No longer enjoying things, you may be feeling tearful, or you may be feeling nothing at all, like empty, numb, a bit dead inside, exhausted, struggling to concentrate, moving slowly, or being agitated, like that exhaustion, sleeping too much or not sleeping enough, overeating or undereating, and really commonly, especially in males, you can see irritability or outbursts of anger, because anger is actually, it's what we call a secondary emotion. Anger never comes first. Underneath anger can be, I felt disrespected, I feel lonely, I feel dismissed, and then comes anger. And anger is safe, right? Like I feel like I can do something when I'm angry. It's more comfortable to feel than sitting with, I feel inadequate or I feel rejected, right? So, really commonly in males and actually in teens, you'll see irritability or outbursts of anger. And you can see an excessive amount of inner criticism and guilt, and often a feeling of worthlessness. And depression can range from mild, moderate, and severe. And with more mild to moderate, you can see this indifference towards life. Like, I just really don't care what happens to me. Like, if I didn't wake up, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And with more moderately severe to severe depression, you can actually hear suicidal thoughts or planning to end one's life. And I will say that suicidal thoughts or thinking about acting on a plan, these are all what we call a mental health crisis. Okay, they're very serious. And if you're having those thoughts, or you know of someone having those thoughts, you have to get help. Okay, so just as a summary, how do I know if it's normal sadness or if it's depression? We all experience sadness. I know for so many of us, we're feeling sad about not being able to travel, having to wear a mask. Maybe you've experienced a loss, and there's a lot of sadness, right? Now, sadness will usually last, um, depending on what happened, a few minutes, a few hours. If it's bigger, a few days, but you're still enjoying things. So I can feel sad and still enjoy watching a movie or enjoy watching Oprah videos or spending time with a loved one. With depression, you're not able to enjoy things in the same way anymore. Okay. And you are never ever seeing suicidal thoughts or behaviors with healthy healthy sadness. And with depression, you can almost see it as being in an abusive relationship with yourself. You're seeing a lot of inner shame, guilt, and hopelessness. Okay. And just I'll name that there's a big difference between guilt and shame. So guilt is behavior specific. Guilt is, why did I do that? Like, I wish I would have called that person, or, like, I wish I would have managed that situation a bit differently. Guilt is about the behavior. Shame is about you as a person. What kind of person am I that I did that? How could I have done that? What's wrong with me? And shame is one of the most lethal, visceral emotions. It's the one that makes you feel very alone. And it's like that feeling of worthlessness. And usually, where we carry shame, it's like, I don't want anyone to know anything about that. It makes us feel very disconnected. And when you are moving through or surviving through depression, there can be a lot of shame and hopelessness. Okay. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to speak about anxiety. And I want to name that every single person has anxiety, right? If you say, "Oh, I'm never anxious," I don't know, you're like an alien then, or because we all have anxiety. Now, there's a range of this. So, for example, if you have a deadline coming up or a big project that you care about, or maybe you're presenting to a lot of people, you're feeling some anxiety. And that is actually healthy. It lets you know, like, I care about this, like, concentrate, focus. Some anxiety also tells you to be a bit cautious when you go outside. Don't get too close to anyone, keep your mask on, don't go and hug anyone, or all of these things. If you had no anxiety, you'd be like hugging everyone, not wearing a mask, and like not washing your hands. Okay. Like, some anxiety is actually good for us. Now, there's another form of anxiety that is a bit more extreme that is also good for us. And it is called the fight or flight response. So I want you to imagine you're in, I don't know, Waitrose or Spinneys or somewhere shopping, and someone comes near you and it appears as though they're going to sneeze on you. Now, this is immediately going to activate your fight or flight response. And what your body starts doing is either you fight this person, you beat them up, or you run away, right? And so your heart starts racing, and your heart is pumping blood to all of your major muscle organs. It's saying, I'm getting you ready to fight or to run away. Another thing that's happening is your pupils kind of constrain, they get super focused. Your frontal lobe, so this part of your brain, shuts off, because this is where higher order thinking happens. Strategy, creativity, innovation. You don't need that when it's time to run or to fight. So that shuts down. Digestion, fertility, any system that's not needed is shutting down in that moment. You can even feel blood rushing away from your toes and your fingertips, and it's going to those major muscle organs. So sometimes people, when they're panicked, they'll say, like, my fingers were tingling, like parts of my body, like my toes, like it didn't feel good, right? That is all that fight or flight response being activated. And humans are really the only creatures that can think their way into a panic. So you can think, um, you know, no one likes me, or I'm going to fail, or I'm going to be fired. And you can be sitting in your living room and the fight or flight response is activated, right? And so you can imagine someone struggling with clinical anxiety, the level of fear or worry does not match the situation. So imagine logging into this webinar where you are completely anonymous, but feeling the level of fear like someone was going to sneeze on you. It doesn't match, right? And you can imagine that that's quite terrifying. So, anxiety is very, very physical. And the most severe form of anxiety is a panic attack, right? And that is also a mental health crisis. And, hallmark sign of those, they come out of completely nowhere. They can be triggered by something specific, but not always. And they present almost like a heart attack. So it feels like you're dying. Okay. So common symptoms are many of the fight or flight responses I've mentioned. chest pain, blushing, dizziness, headaches. Really commonly, if you're anxious, you'll see GI issues, almost IBS-like symptoms, because your body's like evacuating what's in your stomach all the time. It's like threat mode, like fight or run away. And really commonly, there will be excessive fear or worry. It can feel like your thoughts are looping, right? Kind of like stuck on a wash cycle. And you can also see catastrophizing. So something happens and the mind jumps to the worst case scenario. That is a very classic symptom of anxiety. It's not that someone's just a worrier. Warrior. Why do the warrior and worrier sound so similar? Okay. And another thing that's common is it will be hard to retain information or concentrate, right? Because when there's a threat, you don't need to retain information. And I had a situation once where many years ago, I was working with a client and he could not remember what was happening in meetings because he was so anxious. So he started recording what was happening in the meeting and then going home and transcribing it so he could remember. And you can imagine this was taking up so much time and energy and interrupting his relationships because it's just taking up so much space. And while he's transcribing and trying to make sure he remembers everything, there was also that loud inner critic. What's wrong with me? Why can't I concentrate? Why can't I remember? Even though this was a very high performing individual. Okay. So it's hard to concentrate. You may see irritability, and most people don't say, I'm so anxious. They'll say, I'm stressed, I'm on edge, I can't switch off. Okay. And behaviorally, if there's social anxiety, they may avoid social situations, which I know can be confusing because we shouldn't be, gathering right now. That many people will, I guess I'll name that there's a lot of different types of anxiety disorders. We're not getting into all of that, but even things like specific phobias are types of anxiety disorders, like fear of flying, fear of insects, fear of blood. And if there's a specific phobia, you may see that person really avoiding specific situations. Most people try to cope with their anxiety, which is the same way we have to try and find ways to cope with pain. So I'll often hear people say, I can't sleep, or I'm feeling really anxious. And if you're in threat mode, your sleep will be disrupted. So your body's like, what do you mean you're relaxing and you're laying in bed? I'm terrified, right? So it'll be hard to sleep. And if there is the use of alcohol to sleep, that creates more risk of depression coming along as well, because alcohol is a depressant. Okay. So just as a summary, what is the difference between normal worry versus clinical anxiety? We all experience worry. Healthy worry is typically triggered by something specific, right? Like maybe you're waiting for your COVID test, PCR test results to come. You're a little bit like, what if I have it? That's really understandable, right? It's temporary. Once the situation has resolved, the anxiety or the worry usually goes away. With clinical anxiety, it can be triggered by a situation where there's a big fear response, but sometimes there's no trigger, right? You can actually wake up feeling that sense of dread. And you're going to see that anxiety is interrupting your life in some way. Healthy worry, you may see if I'm feeling anxious, I'm a little bit distracted, or I'm a little bit off, but it's to a minor degree. You can see suicidal thoughts with clinical anxiety, never with normal worry. I don't like the word normal, healthy worry. Okay. And very similar to depression, with anxiety, you will also see that loud inner critic, shame, guilt, or hopelessness. And I will name that anxiety and depression are like best friends. The longer one goes untreated, the longer the other one comes along, and you can often experience both. Right. So we're going to talk about the things you can do to have good emotional hygiene, and then we'll have some time for questions. All right. So emotional hygiene, one pillar of this, like your foundation. So imagine the foundation of Burj Khalifa. You can't build nothing on top of poor foundation, right? So this first bullet point, I know you're all like rolling your eyes, like, yeah, okay, I know I need to exercise and go to sleep. But I'm just re-emphasizing this. If you came into my office and you said you're not feeling well or you're feeling low and you're not sleeping at least 7 hours, you're not moving your body in some way, drinking water and eating well, we have to start there, right? Sleep is actually the single most effective thing you can do for your mental health. So that means 7 hours of uninterrupted. You actually sleep through it. Okay. So start there. If you're not feeling well, you're like, I don't feel good, or there are a lot of risk factors, go to sleep. Okay. Like be really protective of your sleep. And you can even, I encourage you to Google sleep hygiene. We have separate talks just on sleep. Okay. And another thing I'll say is, and this is really one of the things I wish I knew when I was younger, which is pay attention to emotional pain or triggers. And I mean, the first thing we're saying is emotions are meant to be felt, they're not meant to be thought through. Okay, so you can think about what you're feeling, but emotions are meant to be released. If sadness comes, we're like, okay, why am I feeling sad? Yeah, okay, this is why. Now feel it, be with it, allow yourself to feel it, even if it's for a minute or two. This is a tenet of emotional hygiene. If you do not feel your feelings, or you dismiss them, or you ignore them, or you're like, what's wrong with me? Be strong, suck it up. That harmful response is a part of poor mental health. And when you do not feel your feelings, it's like putting debt on a credit card. I promise you, it does not go away. It's just being stored in your body because the body keeps score. Okay. And I won't go into all the research that supports that. So pay attention. If you notice that you're feeling sad or angry or resentful, be curious. Now, imagine if you said to me, I have stomach pain most evenings, we'd start investigating and say, okay, what are you eating? How long? Go to the doctor. What's going on? The same is true for emotional pain. Just start getting curious about it. When does this hopelessness come up? How long have I been feeling this way? What's going on here? Start gathering information. Another important thing to be curious about would be triggers. So if you notice that someone says something to you and you're like, whoa, you get angry, you're like, ah, or you get really sad, they have just triggered emotional pain in you, right? So the same way, like if my wrist was hurting and someone came along and like grabbed it, and I'm like, oh, you've triggered physical pain. The same is true for emotional pain. And I know we've all experienced this. You say something to someone, usually it's your partner or your spouse, and they have this big reaction. And you're like, what did I say? Like, what just happened? You've touched something that was stored within them, right? And if you have a pattern of stockpiling pain and holding things inside of you, right, then there can be that big trigger that comes out of nowhere. And you're like, whoa, what came over me? So get really curious about that, because that pain is pointing, emotions are messengers. They're pointing to something. They're saying, pay attention to me. There's some pain here that needs to be acknowledged, addressed, felt, and released. Okay. So that's one. The other thing is almost like a bit of a framework shift within yourself, which is the most important relationship you will ever be in is the one you're in with yourself. And if you are in a neglectful, harmful, self critical relationship, that is the biggest predictor of poor mental health or going on to develop depression, anxiety, or other issues. Yeah. So be curious. Like, imagine you leave today's webinar and you put on a white lab coat and you just start observing. Do I ever check in with myself? Right. So imagine you're in a marriage with yourself. And if you came to me and said, my partner never asks me how I am. Like, we just don't talk about how we are. Okay. We're saying there's a disconnect there, right? Or imagine you say, well, anytime I go to my partner and I say, I'm feeling sad or I feel hurt, they're like, ignore. Or maybe even worse, they say, what's wrong with you? Get over it. Why are you being weak? That would be a critical response, right? So be really curious, because how you speak to yourself impacts your mood, how you're feeling, and your self esteem and your self worth. So get really, really curious. And if you're noticing that you're quite harsh with yourself, And this is actually something we work on extensively in therapy. But I'm saying this is a starting point. Get really curious. Like, would I say that to someone I love? Would I speak to them that way? You know, how do you speak to yourself when you make a mistake? Do you hold yourself accountable with respect? Or is there a dismissing or a degrading that happens? Right? Or do you just completely, like, how do you respond even to your successes? Do you savor them? Do you celebrate them? That really is a central core of emotional hygiene, that relationship to the self. Okay. So I'm going to put that out there. And I'll also say that, you know, when I said to you, like, be curious about how you're feeling, the research tells us people only know three emotions: happy, sad, and angry. As you can see, these are not the only three emotions. So get really curious about building this emotional granularity around, okay, I felt angry. Okay, what was beneath that? Humiliated, let down, disrespected. The more granularity you have, the more EQ or emotional intelligence you're building. And that is a part of emotional hygiene. Okay. So that's there. And you can Google this. You can take a picture of it. We'll send it to you. And if you Google emotion wheel of emotions, there will be many other wheels that come up as well. So that's a really good tool to use, right? So other things will be, give yourself permission to feel your feelings. And people always say to me, like, what the heck? Like, what does that mean? I don't know how to feel my feelings. So the way that you do that is almost like you cannot control what feelings arrive, right? Our control is only over how we choose to respond to them. So sadness comes, anger comes, loneliness comes, almost like an uninvited guest. You're like, gosh, you're like, I didn't want you to come over, but here you are. The guest comes, and you must get curious about the feeling. All right, what does this look like? What color are you? Where do I feel this loneliness in my body? Is it a lump in my throat, in my heart, in my stomach? If this feeling were a weather forecast, what would it be? All of this curiosity is you feeling the feeling, and you can do that for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. So get curious about it, feel the feeling. Another tool that is a part of emotional hygiene is the acknowledgement that you stay focused on what you are in control of, right? So there's two things I'm saying. It's not like don't feel your feelings, just focus on what you can control. It's I feel my feeling. I can say that I'm feeling sad. I can say that I'm feeling hurt. I acknowledge all of my feelings. I'm curious about them. And I also come back to my circle of control, which is what are the things that I can do in this hour or in this evening to comfort and soothe what I am feeling, right? That's very different from saying don't feel it, numb it out, eat it, distract myself, work so I'm not feeling my feeling. It's acknowledging and then focusing on what you can control. Now, if you're feeling anxious, you do not want to have caffeine. Caffeine is going to worsen your anxiety, and alcohol is a depressant. So if you're going through a tough time, that can it can make depression worse, or it can create more risk of it. Anytime you're not feeling great, some of these points fall under the umbrella of do no harm. So if you're like, I don't feel so good, I feel a bit vulnerable, I feel a bit fragile, like I'm not feeling myself, do first thing first, do no harm. So, excuse me, don't watch the news. Don't be around people that exhaust you or deplete you. I want you to get really protective of taking care of yourself. Okay. Another tool to work on building that is a part of emotional hygiene is asking for what you need, right? From yourself. What do I need from me? And what do I need from others? What do I need from my manager? What do I need from my spouse? What do I need from my team? And being very explicit about it. We tend to think that people should be mind readers. And I promise you, they don't know what you need unless you ask, right? And really, a central tool I've been alluding to all throughout today's talk is mindfulness. And that is observing, being curious. What am I feeling? What's coming up for me? What is this? because you experience thoughts and feelings. You are not them, right? So the sky experiences the weather, but the sky is not the weather, right? So we experience certain thoughts and feelings and thought patterns, but you are not those thoughts. You experience them. So mindfulness is the tool to observe, like, whoa, where did my thoughts go? What's coming up for me now? And it's super evidence based. You can do your own research on that. I love, his name is Dan Harris. He wrote a book called 10% Happier. And even if you YouTube him, he has some great, like, I think they're very like man friendly mindfulness meditation. So I would look at those. And really, when you're not feeling well, or even if you are feeling well, is to consciously breathe. You wouldn't believe that when we're stressed, our breathing actually gets quite shallow. So, conscious breath, I encourage you to take one with me right now. So, in through your nose, out through your mouth. That is a gift to your body and to your mental health. Okay. So, conscious breathing is also a part of emotional hygiene, and also making sure that you're celebrating small victories, like really savoring them. What does it feel like to accomplish that, to feel proud of something, to feel connected to others? That is actually a part of not only good mental health, but great mental health. All right. Okay. So how are we doing on time? It's 12 o'clock. So I've went a little bit over, but what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to stop there. I'm going to take a few questions for 5 minutes. For those of you who have stayed, thank you so much for making the time. And I'm going to take some Q&A, some question and answers now. So you can just leave them in the chat box below. We have a question, will it go away? Depression. So depression left untreated usually will get worse. Sometimes circumstances may change, or even with exercise and sleep hygiene, you can find that exercise can be as powerful as a antidepressant for mild to moderate depression. So sometimes it can go away, but most of the time, untreated, it actually gets worse. We have a question. How do you tell your employer you're suffering? So that's a really, really important question, because if you find that there's a lot of stigma or a lack of psychological safety in your workplace, you may not feel comfortable going to your employer. I hope that your employer or manager or team leaders are empathic. You may even say, I attended a session today and I wanted to name to you that I am struggling. And I would also go to them and ask for anything you need, right? Like if you can, keep it an open-ended conversation. But I would do that if there's safety, if you know that they're not going to discriminate against you or be judgmental, where they're actually now doing more harm to you. Okay. And I would also encourage you to go to your HR, speak to them, ask them, what kind of services do we have? Do we have an employee assistance program? Do we have, does our insurance cover counseling or psychiatry? Getting information on those resources can be helpful as well. So, interesting question. What if I don't have depression? Is there a need for therapy? So, therapists, we're here if there's crisis, right? We're here if there's depression or crisis or trauma. But I really want to change this notion that you only come to therapy if something is really wrong, right? Like, even if you want to understand yourself better, many of the clients I see don't have necessarily a clinical issue. They just want to understand themselves better. They want to build the skill of feeling their feelings or have more emotional insight. Um, and so you don't have to come to therapy only when something is wrong, right? You can come if you just want to learn about yourself more, or if you're just feeling a bit off. You may be in a high risk space. um, I was We have a comment. I was taking meds for depression last year, but I stopped without seeking my doctor's advice. I feel fine, but I'm a bit scared that it might trigger it again. Do I still have to visit my doctor again? I don't want to be dependent on meds. So I really encourage you to speak to that doctor. Abruptly stopping an antidepressant can be dangerous. So I would definitely say check in with your doctor and tell your doctor, I don't feel comfortable with medication, and make sure you're having therapy at that time as well. Usually antidepressants are not going to be addictive, but you want to speak to the psychiatrist about that. So we have a comment. If a person cannot move on from things or situations he or she did before from that experience, and they're taking too much risk that's even not good for them, the feeling can stay inside for a long time. What advice can we give them? Well, that sounds like they're struggling. Um, if they cannot, if you're noticing that they're talking about it a lot, or a past experience or trauma is affecting them a lot, you want to be empathic and name to them, I'm worried about you. So don't try to fix it. Express care and concern and encourage them to get professional help. So you may say, I'm worried about you. I've noticed that this is still impacting you. Would you be open to checking in with someone? Would you be open to speaking to a counselor? So we can only ever express our concern. And they may have a lot of misinformation about mental health, and you may be able to speak to them about it and normalize help seeking. Like, it doesn't mean you're crazy. They're there the same way. If your stomach was upset, you'd go to a stomach doctor. If your head was hurting, you may go to a GP or a neurologist. The same is true for our mental health. So you really want to take a normalizing approach. All right. So thank you so much, guys, for taking the time to attend today's session. We will be sending a recording and a handout of the session. And take care. Have a lovely day. And your mind matters. I hope you take better care of yourselves after the session. Take care. Bye.